Story 1. I was at an airport terminal some years ago, waiting for a plane to fly east from San Diego. An old man struck up a friendly conversation with me and started telling me how he was leaving the city for the last time, how every day for the last 15 years he had walked a trail behind his house to visit his dog's grave, and that morning was the last time. I was nearly in tears at how sweet it was. But then he kept talking. I'm also going to miss the girls down in Tijuana. They'll treat you like a king no matter if you're old and unattractive like me. They'll do things your wife would never dream of for $20. He continued rambling on about Mexican prostitutes in shocking detail with an almost wistful look in his eye. Fortunately, we didn't sit next to each other on the plane. Story 2. Two men were chatting after not seeing each other for over a decade. One asked, "What happened to your son?" The other responded, "Oh, he's in prison for murder." The first man chuckled and said, "So it goes," before they moved on to another topic. I was amazed at how casual they were about it. Story 3. He and his brother fathered multiple children in Vietnam with various women during the war and largely avoided contact. They were casually chatting with the family during a get-together when the conversation eventually turned to the war. One of the other uncles mentioned, "You have a couple of kids over there, right?" He and his brother nodded, and they spent a few minutes talking about the Vietnamese women they had impregnated while serving there. They acted as if it was acceptable, since they were just sex workers and girlfriends, claiming they hadn't forced anyone. However, the casual and almost comedic way they discussed it was astonishing. Additionally, they were both married at the time this occurred, and one of their wives was sitting right there with us while the discussion took place. She was aware of it, had heard about it multiple times before, and was unfazed by the conversation. Story 4. I was talking to a coworker during lunch one day, just making small talk, when he said to me, "Yeah, my dad used to train squirrels to chase people off our property." He explained that his dad would feed the squirrels in their yard and got them comfortable enough to follow commands. They started chasing off stray cats and even people who wandered too close to the house. He said it so casually, like it was totally normal. The craziest part was that animal control eventually got involved because the squirrels were getting too aggressive, and they had to relocate some of them. I still don't know if that's really the truth or if there's a gang of attack squirrels out there. Story 5. I went with my spouse to their work party, where a coworker admitted to having a child when she was 22, with a 15-year-old boy. I spent the entire night wondering how she wasn't in prison. Story 6. A military beneficiary mentioned at a gathering that he was one of 10 children and they were very poor. Sometimes for amusement, they would tie up their younger sister, sprinkle crumbs on her, and wait for the mice to crawl all over her while listening to her scream. He told it as if it were a funny story, showing no remorse or sense that it was wrong to do that. Later, it was discovered that she committed suicide. Story 7. A coworker told me he doesn't use toilet paper. He just lets it dry and flakes it off later. I feel uncomfortable even sharing this, but he always seems to have an unpleasant odor. He mentioned it as though it were the most normal thing in the world, and he does not joke around. In fact, he can be quite aggressive, and we nearly got into a confrontation, but that is a story for another time. Additionally, he also has a habit of eating his boogers. Story 8. I used to work in a restaurant where my manager mentioned that one of the line cooks bragged about killing someone while he was drunk. Earlier, that line cook had choked another line cook during an argument about who was better at their job. Surprisingly, that restaurant never faced a lawsuit. Story 9. I was the one who mentioned it. When my grandmother disapproved of someone my mother was dating while living at home, my grandmother would sleep with him. As a result, my mother would no longer want anything to do with him. Story 10. I worked for a well-known hospital and wrote articles for their corporate magazine. I interviewed a man who donated millions and asked him what inspired his philanthropy. He said, "I mainly do it to receive preferential treatment from the doctors and staff." I was speechless for a few moments after he said that. He was completely serious. Story 11. I took a guy I was dating to see his mom. Naive me expected coffee and cookies in a house. Instead, I met with her and her boyfriend in a small apartment. She said we needed to cut the visit short because she needed to sleep with someone for drug money, And her kids acted like that was totally normal and started saying goodbyes. Not judging, but it was painful and made me realize how good I've had it. Story 12. A friend from high school told me about his weekend. He went to a neighbor's house. She was home alone, so he went in and hung out. He said, "I hit on her and she said no." Then he continued, "I was going to leave, but instead I just started hurting her." He said it so calmly that I thought I had misunderstood him. I asked, "What?" He repeated it. I was shocked. I don't know how he expected me to respond. I left, went to her house and found her crying with her mom. They had called the police. I stayed and told the police what he had said. I heard he killed someone a few years ago. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Story 13. A guy I knew in high school named Steve said he liked to wait until girls at parties got drunk and then make out with them because it was easier. Even my 16-year-old self, with a not fully formed prefrontal cortex, knew that was wrong. Story 14. In college, at a small party, a girl I was interested in told me that she loved to have relations with the family pet, a Doberman. To this day, I believe it's better for my mental health that she conveyed that in such an off-the-wall way to get me to stop talking to her. It worked. As a truck driver, I've had multiple coworkers across different companies admit some bizarre things. One guy said he wouldn't shower until he smelled like rancid beef for 3 days straight. Another spoke almost poetically and in graphic detail about how much he loved the ladies of the night in West Memphis. Finally, my favorite, which I hope was just an incredibly tasteless joke, was a guy talking about how he liked to copulate with roadkill. Reading that back, I'm glad I don't work in over-the-road trucking anymore. Story 15. An acquaintance shared a story from his past. He was in the process of getting a divorce and did not want to pay child support for his 3 children. He had his friend spike her drinks so she would fail a custody drug test and lose her job as a teacher. She became addicted, experienced a downward spiral, and disappeared for about 20 years until she eventually recovered and turned her life around. This man was still proud of causing his children to grow up without their mother in their lives. Story 16. A coworker I once had did not last very long for various reasons. He casually shared how, when he was 13, he and his friends shared a blow-up doll. One would use it, and then the next guy would ask, "Can I hang on to that for a few days?" He told us this as if it were a hilarious story. I thought he might regret admitting something like that to a group of people who essentially all considered him strange for it. However, a few weeks later, he must have forgotten he shared the story because he casually told us again. He must tell the story often. This guy's head was in a different universe. Story 17. I was at work, chatting with a coworker about childhood pets when she casually mentioned, "My sister and I used to play this game where we'd hide raw shrimp in each other's rooms. The rule was you couldn't say anything. You just had to find it before it started to stink. Is that normal?" Story 18. One summer in high school, I worked in a kitchen that ran a vocational program to help former inmates learn a trade. I was one of 2 high school students hired to assist, along with a girl. The people running the program didn't want her around the former inmates, so she worked at the front cash register while I was in the back preparing food with the others. I got along with most of them, and we usually had a good time. There was one guy who mostly kept to himself and made the soup of the day. Everyone knew he had anger issues. He would explode over the smallest things, like disagreeing with the chef about how to prepare the soup. One day, he started slamming ladles and pots around because he was upset with the chef for some reason. So the chef sent him to the front to work the register. The girl returned to work with us, but about 20 minutes later, the vocational staff reacted strongly to that. I guess he couldn't be around cash, and told him to go back to the kitchen. When he returned, he was complaining about the staff and casually mentioned that he had killed someone before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. I was just standing there, trying not to panic as he looked at me with wild eyes. I really thought he might snap. He never did anything, but after that, I made it a point to keep my distance from him. Story 19. An older man started chatting with me on the bus. Strangers often approach me, although I'm shy. My face must look friendly. He told me he had once gone to prison for killing a man. It was one-punch manslaughter, not premeditated, but he complained about it as if he were the victim. The other man was gone, Yet he still had to serve a sentence, so I didn't feel sympathetic. Suddenly, I remembered I needed to get off at the next stop. I felt anxious about taking public transport for a while after that. Story 20. An elderly man casually pointed out the window of the bus and said, "See that building over there? That was the first bank I robbed." It turned out he had just spent 20 years in prison for robbing half a dozen banks. I asked him what he spent his money on, and he mentioned buying expensive vintage cars and taking them to the auto shop where my dad used to work. I'm pretty sure his tips contributed to the purchase of my new bike one Christmas. Story 21. My friend told me casually that they accidentally set their kitchen on fire twice and still weren't sure what went wrong either time. Maybe it's you? Story 22. The maintenance person at work said his children were afraid of cockroaches. So he took some cockroaches, ground them up, and mixed the bits into their cereal without telling them. I have questions, but my initial horror overrode my ability to speak at the time. Now it would be very strange to bring it up again. Story 23. In my teens, my older brother had a group of friends over, and they were all in their 20s from what I remember. One guy was asking to see our 2-ball pythons. While he was holding mine, he was trying to convince me to sell her to him, and he and his girlfriend or wife started talking about the turtle they had until their young child threw it against the wall and killed it. Everyone started laughing except me. I took my snake back and told him no, even when he started offering more than my wild type was worth. This is why I don't talk to people in real life about pets. Everyone feels the need to tell you about their hamster, lizard, fish, bird, etc. that died not only horrifically, but it's almost always completely preventable or due to neglect. They often share experiences that they never learned from, which at best just made them stop getting more pets after their dog killed their 4th bird. Story 24. An old coworker mentioned the story of how he tried to rob a casino with a gun and took a hostage in the process. "You know, it was foolish behavior," he said. Yes, he went to prison. Story 25. This disastrous first date I went on was unparalleled in how the conversation devolved. 1. He randomly mentioned that he has a child. Okay, not a big deal. The child is 13 years old, and this guy is 28 years old. Some strange math to start. The last time he saw his child, the child was 9 years old. He has no plans to see his child until the child is 18 years old. He believes he will just tell his child that the mother is insane and trying to trap him into marriage. He genuinely believed this. The child's mother was, at the time of the date, engaged and had been dating her fiancé since just before giving birth. The child's father, the man I was with, mentioned that his mother does free babysitting on most weekends and that he doesn't want to go see his child then. I was in literal awe. He spoke as if it was the most normal conversation. Right before the end of the date, he actually worried that I would judge him for being anti-vaccine. Sir, we were long past that concern. Story 26. I knew someone in college who casually admitted to an attraction to trees, claiming to have engaged in sexual acts with more than one tree. I'm pretty sure he was trying to provoke a reaction from people, but it usually ended the conversation. Story 27. I had a coworker whom I would occasionally invite over because I felt sorry for him. He and his wife were separating, and he shared that she was staying with and sleeping with an older man they had met at a bar. He mentioned that he often stayed up drinking most nights, and one night he punched his wife while he was drunk. Suddenly, everything made sense. He was always quiet and standoffish at work because he was hungover, and his wife was leaving him because he had hit her. Story 28. While training for a new job, we were sharing fun facts. The man next to me casually said, "I'm a polyorchid." He looked me in the eye and added, "I have 5 testicles." Story 29. Chatting on the subway with a new coworker I had met a few days earlier, she told me about a time at Cornell when she and her friends saw someone jump into the river and not come up, which led them to search for someone to inform, but nobody around seemed to care. It wasn't a suicide, which I realized I may have implied. The situation was stranger. She described it as a hot day at a swimming hole, with a large crowd enjoying themselves. People were jumping into the water, and she noticed someone jump in but then realized they did not come up. After a while, she thought, "Wait a minute. Did that guy ever come up again?" I don't remember the exact details, but she mentioned being somewhat intoxicated on that beautiful sunny day, with everyone around her having a great time and music playing, while they were trying to get anyone to notice the kid they believed had just drowned. Tragically, it turned out that someone had indeed drowned. It sounded like a nightmare. She was recounting all of this with a normal tone, and I was nodding and listening, making an effort to be empathetic. I sensed that she needed to talk about it more than she realized it was casual conversation, but internally I was thinking, what just happened? Until now, we had only talked about the weather. Story 30. A vegan acquaintance was eating a cup of clam chowder. When asked about it, she said she was avoiding the clams. Story 31. A new coworker and I were out to lunch when she casually mentioned that she was using cocaine in the bathroom. We worked at a law office. She stated it as if she were telling me the time of day. I acted like it was completely normal, but in my mind I was thinking, what in the world? Story 32. Heard the neighbor's wife tell her husband at the block party that she is sleeping with her daughter's husband. Story 33. I was extremely angry when I heard this from a classmate. To make matters worse, his father was my science teacher. I confronted that classmate and transferred out of his father's class as soon as I could. I strongly dislike animal abusers. Story 34. A girl who was teaching me German told me in all seriousness that the mustache man wasn't such a bad guy. I stopped talking to her the next day, and my German online group was horrified. Story 35. The scariest person I ever met was a South African ex-police officer, now a security guard on my college campus in London. He told me about killing rapists on the side of the road in South Africa so they would receive justice, as the judicial system was broken. He spoke about it as if it were nothing. Judge, juror, and executioner rolled into one. I am shuddering now to remember him. Story 36. I have a good friend who has significant relationship anxieties and fears of being alone. She admitted to me several times, throughout various relationships, that she was ready to move on but would wait for a holiday or birthday to pass. On one occasion, she let a man finish helping her remodel her kitchen before breaking up with him. This changed how I view her, and I have kept my distance since that admission. Story 37. Someone told me that they stayed with their husband long enough to get pregnant a second time because they wanted 2 children with one man, regardless of who that man was. There was no intimacy after the pregnancy test came back positive. The couple ended up getting divorced when their second child was 1 year old. Story 38. I worked as an engineer at a factory for 5 years. One of the senior designers and I were pretty close. He was very technical, college-educated, and overall a great person. He was probably the person I was closest to at work. One day, we went to lunch together and carpooled. I forget the topic of our conversation, but he said, "I can't believe people really think we went to the moon." The statement itself wasn't surprising, but the fact it came from him really threw me off. Story 39. A coworker's sister-in-law shared that she disciplines her children by putting them outside or in the garage when they misbehave. Sometimes, she will hit them with a rolled-up newspaper. The children would bark like dogs and beg at times. Her mother raised her in a similar manner. Story 40. I was talking to a girl who casually mentioned that she ate the heads off all the animal crackers in one go so she could enjoy the bodies later, and that she always had at least one bag at home at any given time. Story 41. I was at a bar once and overheard an older man, probably in his mid to late 60s, telling another man that he had just gotten out of prison for killing his daughter's abusive ex-husband. He mentioned it out of nowhere. He seemed like a nice guy, to be honest. Story 42. When she was a child, her mother had to choose between 2 public schools for her and chose School A over School B because School B was where the minority students attended. This took place in Central California in the 1990s. Story 43. Caitlin from work drove under the influence in Mexico and crashed her car into a wall. She then lied to the Mexican travel insurance company, claiming it was a hit and run, and received a substantial settlement. She spoke about this while laughing and bragging. Story 44. About 20 years ago, I was sitting with friends when one of them began a story about how they took pills to enhance a gas station hot dog maker, and the next day he was experiencing unusual symptoms. Story 45. I had a friend of about 5 years who told me, while we were playing the first Red Dead Redemption, that he doesn't mind cats but hates kittens and tortures them. He would throw them against walls, tie their tails together, and dangle them over laundry lines to watch them fight. I paused the game and said, "You should keep that to yourself." He went into shock mode and responded, "Oh, that was a long time ago. I don't hate adult cats," as if that somehow justified his actions. We sat quietly for a while until he picked up on the vibe and left, and we haven't spoken in about 15 years since. Story 46. In the company kitchen, people were talking about serial killers, including Jeffrey Dahmer. One person joked, "Maybe Jeffrey just wanted to study their heads." "Hey, I'd like to study your head." This individual was so unsettling that it led to an unofficial routine where we would call the last person leaving the office. Story 47. A coworker had a phone call, and I told him I would cover for him while he took it. When he returned, he said his doctor informed him that he tested positive for chlamydia, which he apparently contracted from a tick. I doubt that chlamydia can be transmitted by a tick. I also did not ask what the phone call was about. He shared this information unprompted. Story 48. A coworker mentioned that he kept his son's scholarship for housing at law school. He laughed, saying his child didn't even know he had won the scholarship, and since he was going to be a lawyer anyway, he would earn enough to pay off student loans. We were speechless. Story 49. I have had two people confess murder to me. One was an old boyfriend who shared stories about some gang-related killings he was involved in during his teenage years. He confided in me while we were camping in remote mountains. I recently discovered that he is now in prison for life due to a double homicide he committed just before that confession, apparently acting as a hired hitman. He proposed to me on that trip, and I said no. I am glad I made it home. The second was my best friend, a truly admirable person. He is well educated, very successful, highly respected, and completely trustworthy. While drunkenly waiting for a ride outside of a bar, he confessed to something related to his younger brother's gang affiliation, an action he thought was necessary to keep his baby brother safe. I never mentioned it again until months later when he vaguely referenced the worst thing he has ever done. I noticed a flash of panic in his eyes as he remembered that he had told me. We shared a wordless exchange and he went home. I never heard from him again. Story 50. A colleague shared a story that began with, "You know how you dry out paper towels so you can use them again?" The story was not about that, and he did not pause as if he were asking me a question. I do not even recall what he ultimately revealed because I couldn't move past the paper towels. Story 51. I had a coworker, whom I was meeting for the first time, tell me she was arrested for driving under the influence after crashing into the front of someone's house. Notably, her point in the story was that the officer overreacted when he handcuffed her. Story 52. Not technically overheard, but when I worked at a retail store, one of my strangest encounters was when a man came in and started making small talk, claiming he was in some of the adult videos. If you saw the man, you would realize that was extremely unlikely. I will leave it at that. He mentioned that federal agents were trying to ruin his life. He claimed they secretly filmed him in compromising situations and edited the footage into adult films for distribution. He then stated that when he walked down the street and saw televisions on in people's living rooms through their windows, he believed they were watching the movies featuring him. He added that one day he planned to take action against it, which was alarming. I could only imagine him kicking in some poor family's front door and accusing them of watching unauthorized footage of him. I also want to mention that this was not the only time something like this happened there. A couple of other men came in with the same story, claiming they were in the videos. They would select DVD cases and point to any image where the male performer's face was cropped out or obscured, insisting that it was them, even when their body type and skin color were completely different. I have always found that detail fascinating. I wish I could delve into their minds and see what they were perceiving. Story 53. I really want to hurt somebody, and I feel like I'm running out of time to do it. He had stopped walking as this thought washed over him, and he said it aloud clearly and thoughtfully, as though he were weighing each word. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and resumed walking. He never mentioned it again, but it was so disturbing to me that I reported it to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I felt conflicted calling about my own father, but if he was really going to cross the line from being a conspiracy theorist to a violent conspiracy theorist, then I would hate myself forever if he ended up hurting someone and it could have been avoided. Story 54. My friend's new girlfriend has an 11-year-old daughter. I asked what she's interested in: sports, Pokemon, or Barbie. She casually replied that she enjoys computers and drawing, but she has never eaten solid foods. She only consumes baby food and drinks a specific brand of milk, which has been her diet since she was 1 year old when her mom stopped breastfeeding. Naturally, I spent the rest of dinner asking if she looks excessively thin, if her blood work is abnormal, what happens when she travels, and if they just order large quantities of baby food from Costco. Story 55. My friend, when we were teenagers, told me that his mom gets embarrassed when he walks around naked in the morning. Story 56. My grandfather casually mentioned that his parents were first cousins during a dinner when I was introducing my girlfriend, who is now my wife. No one knew this before. Story 57. That it's not her fault she's autistic. All individuals of certain racial backgrounds are. It's just science. This was said by someone I thought was my friend, but now they are not someone I interact with. Story 58. My friend told me that he was interested in CNC and how elaborate his and his girlfriend's role-playing was. They made very detailed plans that were super realistic and completely unrelated to the Super Smash Bros. Game we were playing. Story 59. I entered a room to start an intravenous line. On that day, I was the charge nurse, and it was the second wave of COVID, so things were quite hectic. An elderly man I had never seen before took one look at me, grinned, and said, "Wow, you're so tall." He then proceeded to tell me how, during the Korean War, they would line up prisoners to shoot them, but the prisoners were much shorter than the Canadian soldiers, so they had to aim the rifles downward. He recounted it as if it were a funny joke that I could share with him, presumably because I was white, female, and tall. I wasn't entirely sure how to respond, so I started the intravenous line and then returned to the nursing station. It was only when I got home that night that I wondered if I should have looked into this. He did confess to a war crime, but it's very likely that the military already knew about it or didn't care. He died that night, so I didn't pursue it. I don't even remember his name now, so there isn't much I could have done, even if I had wanted to. Story 60. My friend said she has a really smelly belly button and jokingly calls it stinky belly button syndrome. She chases her husband around with her finger after she sticks it in there. She is otherwise very clean and says she cleans it, but I don't know. Story 61. I worked with a young woman who mentioned that she left her pet ferret in a cage on her porch the night before, and it froze to death. She then walked away and continued with her day. Story 62. I worked at the airport where my shift lead couldn't get security clearance while they reviewed her pending court case, as she had been indicted for a crime and was awaiting trial. I asked her what felony charge she could possibly have. She kept making a sandwich for a customer as she said, "My ex-boyfriend murdered a guy by shooting him in the head, and I was involved." I replied, "Damn, but you just knew him and that's why, right? You didn't do anything wrong." Naively seeing the best in her, she said, "Nope. I helped roll his body up in a carpet, and we drove to a location and dropped his body in the woods. I was high on meth, so I don't remember it. I'm getting charged with abuse of a corpse." The way she said it was so confident, as if it was just another thing she was mentioning to me at work. I ended up looking up the story, and it was fully true. Story 63. I knew a guy who told everyone about his sex toy that he had to dispose of because he was so obsessed with it that it was affecting his social life. He damaged both ends and threw it away. He reconsidered his decision, but it was too late as the trash collector had already made his rounds. He was heartbroken. Story 64. Oh yes, of course, I am a racist. Everyone in Canada is a racist, said my Canadian colleague, with an air of, well, of course. Story 65. I was in a fancy coffee shop in Mayfair last year, where a lot of the clientele were custom-suited gentlemen. Behind me there was a pair, a younger guy and an older one who I guessed could be his mentor. The older man came in, very posh and polite, and apologized for making them wait. During the usual chit-chat, when asked how he was doing, he said, "Oh, busy weekend." My girlfriend fell off a horse and broke her back, so I had to get her to the hospital. She might be paralyzed for life. The doctors aren't sure yet. Anyway, let's get started on your investment portfolio draft. It was his nonchalant attitude and the way he brushed off a life-changing event that stayed with me. I can't imagine my husband would go to work the next day if something like that were to happen to me. Story 66. I work in a hospital, and sometimes older patients talk about abuse as if it is normal. They may have abused a child or spouse, or they may be experiencing abuse themselves. I have had grandmothers who have been battered discuss being punched in the face as if it were a normal occurrence. This is not something that should ever be considered normal in their lives. Story 67. When people boast about abandoning someone in a casual way, rather than parting ways or working through differences in a mature manner. Story 68. A police officer bragged about committing police brutality. He called it that, not me. He took pride in being racist and homophobic as well and was very open about these views. He stated that if anyone he worked with heard him saying such things, he would probably be fired for it, but he didn't hesitate to tell others. I also remember him mentioning several times how he had to inform parents that their children had committed suicide, which he shared unprompted. He was not a very healthy person. A few more minor stories. I once heard a girl mention that she collected dead animals in plastic bags in her garage. Another girl expressed that her fantasy was a world where all the men stronger than her were killed so she could have her way with the weaker ones. Story 69. One of my acquaintances in my freshman year of high school confided in me and a couple of my friends that he had engaged in inappropriate activities with his donkey several times. Story 70. My friend, a doctor, once told me about his childhood. Very well, where do I begin? My father was a relentlessly self-improving bakery owner from Belgium with low-grade narcolepsy and a penchant for unusual behavior. My mother was a 15-year-old French prostitute named Chloe with webbed feet. My father would womanize, drink, and make outrageous claims like he invented the question mark. Sometimes he would accuse chestnuts of being lazy, the sort of general malaise that only the genius possesses and the insane lament. My childhood was typical, with summers in Rangoon and luge lessons. In the spring, we would make meat helmets. When I was insolent, I was placed in a burlap bag and beaten with reeds, pretty standard really. At the age of 12, I received my first writing tool. At the age of 14, a Zoroastrian named Vilma ritualistically shaved my testicles. There really is nothing like a shorn scrotum. It's breathtaking. I suggest you try it. Story 71. I had a coworker go on a 2-hour rant in my cubicle about how evil Muslims are and that they are out to get us, who are apparently people descended from the Catholic faith. On another occasion, I heard a different coworker ask that same person how atheists could possibly have any morality due to their lack of faith. I have never disclosed my beliefs at work. I identify as agnostic or atheist. Story 72. One of my first jobs, during my first month, I was chatting with my supervisor about our weekends. She went into detail about how she got her urinary tract infection and how she has been dealing with it. I wish she had spared me the details. Story 73. Some guy once admitted to grabbing women inappropriately, and many people were completely okay with it. Story 74. An acquaintance in college casually mentioned how funny it was when he and his parents gave psychoactive drugs to a dog. When people hearing his story reacted with disbelief, his response was something like, "It's okay. We didn't want the dog anymore." Story 75. My friend mentioned that he snapped the neck of every pet dog he had ever owned and demonstrated the technique of how to do it. Story 76. I watched a friend bite her toenails as she actually put her toes in her mouth. Sometimes I wonder if it was a bad dream. Story 77. I had a bizarre interaction with a roommate years ago when I caught him disposing of lint from the dryer by flushing it down the toilet. I asked him why he was doing that, and he looked back in confusion. He told me, "Where else would I put it?" I pointed to the garbage can literally right beside the washer and dryer. He was a very intelligent computer science major. I still look back and wonder what he was thinking. Story 78. There was a discussion years ago where people debated whether they needed to wash their hands after using the toilet. A surprising number of individuals insisted that their bodies and bathrooms were clean, so they felt they did not need to wash their hands after urinating. I have never facepalmed harder. I wonder if any of them survived COVID. Story 79. I had a friend in college who experienced an unfortunate upbringing and family life. Domestic violence, drug use, and past abuse were all part of her reality. It was common for her to speak casually and loudly about her family without realizing that it wasn't typical. We got into a conflict about it once because I tried to quiet her down. I saw it as an effort to protect her, as people would look down on her or make others uncomfortable without realizing it. She thought I was being controlling. That incident was sparked when she was loudly discussing her sister being caught stealing for drugs. Story 80. Making their girlfriend do sex work. They laughed about making her sell her body to get a ride home from the other side of the city. A coworker at a fast food restaurant ended up getting caught by an undercover officer that the boss brought in. The three of us smoked cannabis on my last shift there, and then the undercover officer reported him. Story 81. There is a person at a homeschool co-op I attend who believes the earth is flat. They claim that people lie about carbon dating, insist every verse in the Bible should be taken literally, and assert that dinosaurs are not real, among other things. Story 82. A high school classmate claimed he had inappropriate relations with animals. I found it hard to believe until he was caught engaging in those actions with a goat. Story 83. Nursing homes are filled with individuals sharing confessions about their past actions decades ago. Story 84. Ruby Frank posted a video on YouTube where she refuses to bring her daughter food, who was 6 at the time. Ruby claims her daughter is responsible for making her own lunch and states that she will have to go hungry because she didn't prepare it. She adds, "Hopefully nobody gives her food or steps in and provides her with a lunch." Story 85. My college roommate was talking about his younger sister's series of short-term romances, and he stated, in a seriously concerned manner, that if she became pregnant, he would take drastic action. Story 86. During onboarding training for my new job, we played the game 2 Truths and 1 Lie. One of my new colleagues mentioned that when she was younger, she had drowned a chicken in a bucket of water, and it wasn't a lie. Everyone else was horrified and kept bringing it up for the remainder of the training. Story 87. A man I cooked with in a bar got into growing and selling marijuana with 2 other individuals. One day he said the leader took them far into a remote area and opened a box that contained 4 hand grenades. He had them choose one at random, demonstrated how it worked, then threw it and it exploded. They all took one with the understanding that if one of them informed on the others, the remaining grenades would find them. Months later, he said there was trouble because one guy's brother-in-law found out what was happening and demanded money to stay quiet. They didn't know how to handle it. A week later, he came in and said they stormed into the brother-in-law's house, dragged him to the living room, and they held his hand down on the mantel, and I chopped off 3 of his fingers with a hatchet. I didn't know what to say, so I asked which fingers. He said little ring and middle. I said, "You gave him permanent finger guns?" He thought that was funny and said he was going to tell his partners. Then he said, "I threw them in the woods. Nobody will find them." Story 88. Not me, but my significant other, who was in the military, had a conversation a few weeks ago with our neighbor, a man in his mid to late 50s. They usually talk about gardening, which is a common hobby for them. Out of nowhere, the neighbor told my partner that women who go out to party and drink are asking to be assaulted. His exact words were something along the lines of, "It's like waving a steak in front of a hungry dog." My partner was shocked and responded with 2 points. First, even if that were true, it's still not your steak, and second, people aren't steak. My partner was so taken aback that the conversation drifted away. Now, they have been avoiding interaction with the neighbor because of this disturbing comment. How many women have you assaulted that you think it's okay to say such things? It seems either that this is normal for the neighbor or he believed his audience would be receptive to such remarks. We can only guess that his son recently got into trouble with the law, possibly for assaulting or attempting to assault a drunken woman. This is just speculation, we don't know for certain. I would have been mildly surprised, but I've heard similar comments, including she was asking for it. Even from other women. It has impacted my partner's mood significantly for the week following the conversation. and they still bring it up randomly, questioning, what? Story 89. A coworker of mine once casually mentioned that he had tried to strangle his ex-wife and quickly clarified, I got the cord around her neck, but I didn't tighten it. Story 90. A coworker casually told me how he ran over a woman while driving drunk. I don't think it was reported to the police because where I work, you need to have a clean criminal record. He was peculiar and appeared unintelligent. He followed me once in the parking lot when he learned he was getting fired. It frightened me, but I never saw him again. Story 91. I had a crush on a girl when she made a disturbing statement at a party about a guy who liked her, but was clearly out of her league. He was paying too much attention to her and she brushed it off. However, this was not a light-hearted conversation. It was serious. I expressed concern for her safety, suggesting she should avoid him because he was obviously inappropriate. Her lack of respect for herself, as well as her casual attitude toward the concept of consent, really troubled me. At that time, I had another friend who had experienced sexual assault as a young adult, and it deeply affected her. I wish I could recall the conversation word for word, but it was nearly a decade ago. I can assure you that the way she expressed herself was unsettling to more than just me. Later that night, he attempted to isolate her when she was extremely intoxicated. After her roommate and I helped her get home, we told him to leave her alone. Eventually, I decided to cut her out of my life. She had some serious issues, but I don't regret protecting her from that troubling individual. Story 92. My friend was talking about a personal topic with her boyfriend and said, "Your backside is so gross. It's not like you wash it. So why would anyone want to engage in that?" I had no idea what to say. Then she quickly got off the phone. That was over 10 years ago. I never said anything, but I never forgot either. Story 93. Every summer, a group of seagulls raises their young on our office window ledge. For some reason, the seagulls mainly scavenge dropped food from the high street, leaving chicken bones along the ledge. A group of us was commenting on how we didn't realize seagulls were semi-cannibalistic, such as one bird eating another. One of our colleagues chimed in, saying, "Yeah, but they aren't totally the same, so it's not really cannibalism. I would happily eat monkey." We laughed, thinking she was joking, but then she doubled down to prove why it wasn't that bad. We were a bit surprised. Story 94. I was walking in San Francisco when a woman said casually into her phone, "They buried the gun in Sacramento." My face was shocked. Story 95. My ex told me she bathed her pets when they got sick and held their heads under the faucet. Then, she showed me their graves. Story 96. My first time hanging out with my ex since we broke up over a decade ago. He introduced me to his friends, a couple named Addison and Emily. We piled into the car to grab some marijuana. The guys went in while we stayed in the car. For half an hour, Emily explained the ins and outs of her incredibly toxic relationship. She was constantly cheating on Addison and showed no remorse about it. She told me he had harmed himself over the cheating and mentioned having a miscarriage at 8 weeks, saying it was a little girl. Then she sang happy birthday to her deceased child, and I felt pressured to do the same. Emily later witnessed my ex choke me and threaten me in her home, comforted me afterward, but then threatened me for calling him out for his abusive behavior. I didn't hear from her for almost 3 years after that. She began hanging out with a different ex of mine and attempted to hook up with him by revealing how much she had still cheated on Addison, who was still with her. My other ex told me about it shortly after we got back together, and then Emily sent me a threatening message. I assume she's still out there, cheating on that poor guy. Story 97. At a party, a guy tried to talk to me about how he likes watching videos of people getting cut up and having their heads cut off. He brought it up casually in the middle of the conversation, completely unrelated to the topic. It seemed like he expected me to say, "Oh, no way. Me too." However, we were just engaged in small talk about jobs and getting to know each other. I had only known him for a few hours, having met him at the party. Other than that, he seemed casual and pretty normal. Later in the night, he gave off some weird vibes to my friends, and my girlfriend mentioned that he had a reputation for being strange. I also heard some questionable things about him from other friends. This was my full experience with him. Story 98. Reads a couple of confessions. Well, that's enough of that for the night. I'm off to the Jane Austen subreddit or something. Sleep well, everyone. Story 99. My older brother talked about abortion with our dad and said, they can't keep their legs closed. We're something similar. He is having sex with his girlfriend and makes it seem like it's their fault, as if women get pregnant on their own. He is a typical homophobe who is only pro-abortion when it suits him. I need help. Story 100. After hearing an older man describe tossing his friend into a portable toilet pit a long time ago, he mumbles, we were just joking. No one was supposed to get hurt. Story 101. On January 24th of this year, two friends at the gym were talking about a super secret Trump coin they wanted to invest in and how much money they expected to make. They sounded like 17-year-old kids speaking with extreme conviction and patting themselves on the back. Story 102. A friend casually mentioned that they believe they might have killed a man while drunk driving decades ago. What even is happening? Story 103. A year or two after high school, I crossed paths with a girl I occasionally said hello to. I asked her what she had been doing, and without hesitation, she told me that she had been using crack for a year straight and was living in a motel. At that time, she didn't even know that I used marijuana, and we were not familiar with each other on a personal level. Story 104. A coworker admitted that she tried crack and meth the other day in public. I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. Story 105. When I was in nursing school and going through the psychiatric rotation, we had the opportunity to visit a state mental facility that housed individuals who committed crimes and served prison time but were deemed unfit for release. I interviewed a woman who had murdered her husband. We discussed her background, and then she casually mentioned that she had killed her stepfather and someone else when she was a child. She began talking about it as if it were just casual conversation, but the person I was shadowing suddenly took over and started asking questions, and it was evident that something was unusual. I initially thought she was not being truthful, but my colleague believed she was likely telling the truth and shared information about a cold case where she was a suspect but could never be proven guilty because no one had ever spoken about it. I will never forget how clear and calm her voice was. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.